Good afternoon. I'm Bill Lafayette, a proud member of the CMC Board of Trustees and owner of Regionomics, which is an economic and workforce strategy firm. Thank you all for being here today. Today's forum is CMC's annual Charles Y. and Frances N. Lazarus Legacy Fund Recollecting Columbus History Forum, Restaurants' Surprising Role in Columbus History. Let's thank the Charles Y. and Frances N. Lazarus Legacy Fund, represented here today by Peggy and Stuart Lazarus, their family members and associates, and partners the Columbus Historical Society and Columbus Landmarks Foundation. Our speakers today are noted for their expertise, both officially and anecdotally, for their interest in food, as well as their knowledge of history. And now, in an experimental recipe, we will combine both food and history and see what results. Please welcome historian and author Doug Moats, restaurant reviewer and gourmet cooking instructor Steve Stover, historian and author David Myers, and host for our discussion, restaurant reviewer and yet another gourmet cook, Rich Terapak. Rich, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I think you said we're going to try to come up with a new recipe, and the old adage about too many chefs spoil the broth probably comes to mind. Again, I'd like to thank let's say, Fran and Chuck Lazarus Fund and the whole family sitting over here. For those of us who are privileged to know them, it's a great honor to be underwriting people like us up here. And part of that is because they were pretty fond of food. I remember Fran in the chintz room, I think was one of the last times. This is an august panel. They really are. They've got some good credentials. Well, one's on the, not fair. And the bookends are, but, in fact, we have some books up here we probably display in a little bit. But it's fitting that the Lazaruses are involved because we're talking history, and with history we remember things like the chintz room, the colonial room, the Buckeye room, and a couple others. As a former Lazarus associate, I think I ate at all of them. It's nice to have this opportunity because we can talk about things in sort of a historical perspective without getting people angry at us, which sometimes would happen when Steve and myself and John Christensen and Jim Boudros would get up here and talk about new and notable or the best 10 or et cetera. We'd leave somebody out, we'd get attacked in the lobby. But so we can reminisce a little today. But we will include some of the ones that are still standing, so we have to be nice to them. With Doug and Dave, we have real published historians. Doug and Dave co-authored, along with a couple other people, the Kahiki Supper Club, which is available on Amazon. And we also have the Look to Lazarus, the Big Store, as one of their other publications. Not to be outdone, Steve served as the Ohio editor for the Zagat Guide for over a decade, and he still publishes frequently on our blog at wosu.org, at Chefs in the City. So let's get started. I'll start with Dave, author of Look to Lazarus, the Big Store, and its contribution to culinary history or history in general.
Thank you. I brought a visual aid. This is Look to Lazarus, the Big Store, and we're actually going to start with this. I noticed there are a lot of women here today, which is only fitting given you're an organization that was started by women. Imagine yourself 125 years ago, 1890. Did any of you come here today by yourselves? You wouldn't have back then. Women didn't go into restaurants by themselves. They didn't go hardly any place by themselves. In 1890 in Chicago, at a department store called Marshall's Field, there was this visionary merchant named Harry Gordon Selfridge, who managed to get a television show recently. But he came up with a lot of interesting ideas, and in 1890 he came up with the idea of a tea room. And the tea room was a restaurant which was almost exclusively for women. And it was within the store, so when they do their shopping, they didn't have to leave the store to do it. So they didn't need to be accompanied by men. They were in this safe confine of the department store. Jump ahead a year, 1891. Lazarus Department Stores here in Columbus introduced the Niagara soda fountain, which was a huge serpentine marble soda fountain. They seated 25 in the soda fountain, and it was an immediate success. People loved the Niagara soda fountain. In fact, you can see postcards of the thing. It was so popular. This attracted people, and it served exactly the same purpose. You came to Lazarus to shop, and you didn't have to leave. You could get something to eat while you were there. Up to this time, there were restaurants in Columbus, but as I said, women didn't venture into those by themselves. At least respectable women didn't. So popular was the Niagara soda fountain that in 1909, when they built the new Lazarus, the one that was across Town Street, the one that we're all familiar with, they moved the soda fountain as well. And it continued operation there for many years. In 1910, they've introduced the first tea room in Columbus, and it was at Lazarus Department Store. And it was just called the tea room. They didn't need any further identification. Had the soda fountain and the tea room. 1914, they christened it the fifth floor tea room, and they expanded it in that year from 150 seats to 400 seats because of the popularity. This is significant. 1915, a woman named Mary Love was hired by Simon Lazarus. Mary, he had discovered in Topeka, Kansas. She worked for Fred Harvey Restaurants, the Harvey Girls, you know, the Judy Garland movie. There's a book that came out recently talking about the Harvey Girls. He recognized her talent, brought her to Columbus to operate the tea room in Columbus. 5 years later, Mary Love opened a second tea room, which was called the Balcony Tea Room. Then in 1920, she opened her own place. She left, opened her own restaurant.
Let's see if they can guess.
It wasn't the Maramore yet. That was 7 years away, but she named it the Maramore, Mara after Mary, Amore after love.
Mary Love.
Which became one of the most famous restaurants in Columbus. 1921, he needed to replace Mary Love, so he hired a woman named Helen Sawyer. She had been overseeing the YMCA cafeteria. She had a degree in hotel management from University of Nebraska, and immediately it was recognized as one of the best tea rooms in the country by Hotel Management magazine. The period 1914-1925, Lazarus expanded, added 8 restaurants in total, and then after that, tea rooms followed, pavilion tea room, balcony tea room. That evolved into the Colonial Restaurant, which was modeled after the
Turkey
Raleigh.
dressing engraving.
Yeah, modeled after the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. And then they just added, trying different things. In 1945, they had the Lazarus Pepsi bar, because they were trying to attract teens to it. And then sometime after that, they opened the Associates Cafeteria. I was an associate as well.
Yeah.
3 of us were associates.
I worked at Marshall Fields.
You need to be way over there. 3 associates here,
We should have known.
1,500 seats in the associate cafeteria. And if we have time, I can tell you some anecdotes about that. But Lazarus was really the one where a lot of things were tried. And at one time, they had up to 11 or 12 restaurants going at one time within the store. I want to mention one thing. In 1977, Charles Lazarus was giving a speech at the University of Indiana. And he hired, there was an MBA student there named Iris Cooper, a young African-American woman. And he was impressed with her, invited her to join them at Lazarus. And he didn't know what she wanted to do. She didn't know what she wanted to do. She tried a few things. Finally, he put her in charge of the restaurants. And she opened several, Good For You, which was health-oriented, Home Plate, Charlie's Bistro. He gave her kind of free rein to try whatever she wanted to try. She left 3 years later after getting all this experience, and she went on to be one of the co-founders of Glory Foods. But what I wanted to emphasize from this was how forward-thinking the Lazarus department stores always were. I mean, they gave opportunities to immigrants, they gave opportunities to minorities, they gave opportunities to women when a lot of other places weren't.
Speaking of giving opportunities to women, we were going to ask Doug to talk about how the restaurant world really helped women get into the business and social fabric, I guess I could say, of the city.
Well, sure. No, I'm really thrilled. I'm pleased to see Rob Felty and his daughter here. He's with the Marzetti Company. And any of you remember Marzetti's that may have been just down the way here? Yeah. So Teresa Pianchetti, she comes here about 1891. It's rather unfortunate. Her father had already been over here working on Long Street for his brother at a saloon and as a fruit vendor just around the corner. And he's trying to jump the streetcar, and Teresa's dad goes on the streetcar, and the conductor's saying, don't do it, you're gonna hurt yourself. Sure enough, he did. The streetcar ended up running over his leg, and he's actually our streetcar's first fatality from the electric lines when they became electrified. So Teresa's a part of a big brood in Italy, and her mother decides to send the kids and her daughter Teresa to the United States. So she sails, lands in Manhattan, takes a 3-day train ride, and ends up in Columbus working at the saloon where her dad used to be. She's just 13 years old at the time. And she really doesn't care for it very much there. She really feels like her father's friends aren't taking very good care of her. And so she's introduced to another gentleman by the name of Marzetti, who has a little place across from the OSU campus where it's kind of a lunchroom where he's feeding some of the students. And she falls in there, and she and Mr. Marzetti get along really, really well. In fact, so much so that when she finally turns 19 and he's 45, they marry. So this would have been in 1899. So they end up with 2 kids, and they're doing fine at Marzetti's across the street from campus. It would be approximately where the Gateway is now, just to give you an idea. For those of you who are familiar with Marzetti's that was down here, it would be right about where the Gateway was. So it's going well, but Mr. Marzetti's, again, he's a little bit older, his health is failing him. They decide to bring in a young person from the university who's looking for some work, Carl Schauffele, to work for them, to help out, and he does. And shortly after they hire on Carl, Mr. Marzetti passes away as well. So Teresa doesn't know quite what to do. She never, apparently she had a vision to move forward, according to her grandson. So she does. And eventually she ends up marrying Carl. And they move Marzetti's to Gay Street because they figure we're going to get closer to the business area where we're not depending upon the students for so much. And about this time, along comes a lady by the name of Catherine Hill, also an African-American lady. She comes up here from Georgia in 1933. She's actually the granddaughter of a slave in Georgia. And she's going to church on the east side, and she's looking for a job, and somebody there says, hey, why don't you come to Marzetti's with me? You can be a dishwasher. So she does. She comes and works as a dishwasher, and she does really, really well. She's helping out for a guy that's not there. And Carl says to her, you know, you're doing great as a dishwasher, but I really need somebody who can bake pies. And she doesn't know quite how to bake pies, so she says she prays on it. After about 2, because she can't bake a pie to save her life, and she really can't, and Carl's really kind of on her. He's like, you can't bake this pie, we're gonna have to let you go. So one day she says she prays on it, and the Lord showed her how to bake a pie. And she ends up making these wonderful pies. So Carl's like, okay, you've got that tackled. Now we need you to help us make some coleslaw dressing. Have you ever made coleslaw dressing? And she says, no, but I can give it a whirl. That's the Marzetti coleslaw dressing that we know today. Not only are the restaurants giving a lot of great business to ladies, but they're also giving a lot of business and wonderful opportunities for African-American ladies who are here as well. It's fascinating to me in looking at restaurant history, how much of it really is the women of Columbus. I mean, there are plenty of Cameron Mitchells and Kent Rigsbys and folks that way today, but there are also lots of Teresa Marzetti's. We talked about Mary Love, who ended up with the Maramore.
We'd be remiss if Steve and I didn't mention Betty Rossbottom.
Betty
Our
Rossbottom.
first boss, as it were.
I was thinking of another lady by the name of Betty Parker Brown. Now, that might not be a lady who you would know. Anybody ever eat at the Sign of the Whirling Satellite? BBF,
Yeah,
Burger Boy Foodorama, when Roy Tuggle and Milt Lusnauer got together to fight off the incursion of McDonald's coming to town. She was their marketing person. She's the woman who came up with At the Sign of the Whirling Satellite. So, and then even today we think of, Jenny Britton Bauer, who could teach a class, I suppose, in business ethics about how wonderful she handled her own crisis, and the Liz Lesners of today that are doing such wonderful things. But I mean, restaurant and the restaurant industry really gave entree to a lot of women who otherwise probably wouldn't have had access to the business community of Columbus. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, Steve, you're up next. You're going to tell us a little bit about some political hangouts, but also some of the neighborhood pioneers.
And if I don't, with all these historians around me, if I don't get it right, I'll be history. I guess you could probably say that history or sausage was made in the political hangouts of Columbus. You should note that all of them are within a block of Capitol Square, and we have such great places as the Neal House, which goes back before the turn of the last century, and which had the main bar, and then the Vern Rife, Speaker Vern Rife, used to hang out down in the Red Lion. That's where he would hold court. Top of the Sheraton was very big back in the day, and of course Mario's in the gallery on 3rd was, Carol was shaking her head because that was where Vern Rife would also hang out. Other places, the legendary, venerable Power Breakfast at the Claremont. Judges and lawyers and everybody was down there. And then later in the day, the bar at the Claremont, but also the Round Bar nearby where a lot of the state legislators was hang out. More currently, Lindy's is a very popular spot, the bar at Cameron Mitchell's, the not quite so cool In Between. And earlier, almost forgot that the Maramore was a political hangout. But now, however, for better or for worse, people are so busy attending fundraisers and raising money that this culture has sort of disappeared from political life because it really is a major cultural shift. Going on to Columbus Food Pioneers, Columbus has really come a long way. As the legendary Grumpy Gourmet said, 35 years ago, the only ethnic restaurants in Columbus were Geem Long, Yong May, and Prizzutis. And while that may be true, more recently, Michael Ruhlman, the author of 20 cookbooks, including the French Laundry Cookbook, who's from Cleveland, has dubbed Columbus the best restaurant city in Ohio. So, hello, folks. We do want to recognize some of the neighborhood pioneers who have been so important in building Columbus's thriving restaurant scene. Prizzutis Villa, I mentioned them earlier on Fifth Avenue. Kent and Tazi Rigsby in the Short North. I don't know, I wouldn't even go to the Short North back in the day because the Short North was a dump. And here it is now, a thriving restaurant and part of the social fabric of our city. Hubert and Helga Seifert. I saw him yesterday. They really pioneered and colonized what is known as the Bank Block on Grandview Avenue with the Gourmet Market, Spagio, and Aubergine now. And Hubert said when he opened in 1981, there were about 6 restaurants within a 3-mile radius, and now there are 80. We should tip our hats to Hartmut Hankey, who came back to Columbus and did much for the brewery district and for Columbus's reputation in the food world. Bill Sapp, Lee Henry, this 161 corridor, and which the New York Times described as fried meat row. And then maybe one last tip of our hat to Ziggy, who recently passed away. Other food pioneers, we had Billy Ingram of the White Castle, David Thomas, who went from Colonel Sanders to Wendy's, and Cameron Mitchell, who now has 15 restaurant concepts. And then some of the
Duty
newer,
Brothers and,
the Duty, well, I was just going to mention Piata and Bibimbap, which are now fledgling. But the new trend in Columbus is more the smaller, locally owned restaurants. Liz Lessner was a pioneer with her group, the Malamy husband and wife with the North Star group, and Chris Crater with his Harvest, Sycamore, and other harvests. Now, I must admit that things have not always gone so well for some aspiring restaurant chains in Columbus. One of the most unfortunate belongs to a restaurant that opened on on Riverside Drive, just south of Fishinger. Don't say it if you know it. And on the first night, most of the customers, if not all, ended up with gastric distress, to put it politely. Ironically, if you remember, that restaurant was called Turkey Trot.
Turkey Trot. Okay, we're going to throw out some more topics. By the way, there's the book that the two of you put together, along with a couple other people, I think, the Kahiki Supper Club. Steve just mentioned one of the, or two of the original founders. Tell us a little bit about that before we move on.
Yeah,
And that's also available on Amazon.
Yeah. Here's the book. Bill Sapp and Lee Henry were two remarkable individuals. They were friends from college days at Ohio State, and after they finished college, they were looking for something to do. And since they were young men, they were hanging out at bars a lot, because that's where the women were. And they decided, well, maybe we should get in the bar business. And they found this bar out on the east side called Tops. And it had a spinning top for its sign. And they thought, this place has potential. And so they bought it in 1959 and turned it into the Top Steakhouse. And they said it was like manufacturing money. I mean, they were able to pay off their loans within a year. And they were looking for, new horizons at that point, because it was so easy. And it became a very popular place, and it's still in business. So they're shopping around for ideas, and they traveled widely because they were making good money. And they noticed that the places that seemed to be doing the best had Polynesian themes. It was kind of the tiki bars that were really doing well. Where everything else was failing, they were thriving. So they decided, well, let's build one. And if you know anything about these guys, they didn't do anything halfway. I mean, they started out and they found this barbecue place, again on the east side, and they bought it fairly inexpensively because it had a liquor license. And they converted it very quickly into a place they called the Grass Shack. And this was in 1958. And they saw right away that it became kind of a magnet for returning servicemen and people who really wanted to talk about the time they'd spent overseas. And they found a guy who was a pretty good bartender, just making things up on his own. So they brought him in. He was Sandro Conte was his name, and he experimented with drinks, and they were becoming quite popular. And then one night, the night of Bill Sapp's birthday, 1959, it burnt down. Well, they had already made plans to replace it and build a Polynesian Supper Club. But they hadn't made it, well, it was a little bit earlier than they planned. But they went ahead with this idea of building this huge Polynesian restaurant. They didn't start out to make it the biggest, most grandest Polynesian restaurant in the world. It just turned out that way. Because as I said, they never went about things halfway. And they did a lot of research, and they imported a lot of architectural features for it. And they built Kahiki Supper Club, which opened in 1961 out on East Broad Street, right across from Town and Country Shopping Center, which was thriving at that time, and the Desert Inn. Yes. And again, they'd hit upon a surefire formula. I mean, if you're selling a lot of rum, you're making a lot of money. And so, you add pineapple to everything. You add it to the drinks, you add it to the Cantonese cuisine.
Dry ice.
Yeah, a little dry ice, but heavy on atmosphere, heavy on kind of ritual. You had the mystery girl, and all this. It was very exotic. And, you know, it's full of beautiful women. This is where their contribution to women in Ohio, restaurant business. Now, there were women behind the scenes, though, that they relied upon very heavily to run the place. And so that was doing so well. Again, they were looking for other things to do. And most people probably don't know this, but you had what I call in the book the roast beef wars occurred. And you had all these roast beefs, you know, in the kind of the wake of Arby's, which was from Northern Ohio. You had all these people jumping into the roast beef business. You know, you had Rax got into it. You had, you know, Jerry Lucas, the basketball player, got into it. Jerry Lucas Beef and Shakes. Everybody's getting into this business. Herky Styles got into it. They mentioned to me he's a comedian. Bill was really enamored of the Rax or the Arby's roast beef sandwich, and he wanted to buy a franchise, but they wouldn't sell him one. So they decided they'd build their own, and they created Saxon sandwich shops. And there's still remnants of those around. There's still buildings like on North High. There's still their headquarters, and at the Golden Bear Shopping Center, there's a bank that was a Saxon's. But what they did differently is they had this hot steam jet. And now they were actually using real roast beef instead of this jelly stuff. And they give you a hot blast of the steam to it to heat it up for sure before they give. And they did that for several years. And then they ran into some problems with that concept. But in '71, they were still looking for something to do. And again, they don't do things halfway. And they built the wine cellar on 161. And the beautiful building, you know, it's a shame it didn't last very long. And they went to England, again, brought in architectural features. They brought pilings out of the Thames River for it. They were
That's
making
the problem.
Yeah, they were making molds of the beams and 15th century Guildhall so they could reproduce them over here. It was a fantastic place.
A lot of history, but we got to keep moving
Yeah,
on.
but basically that was to show off Bill's wine collection.
Okay. Steve,
I just wanted to throw out one thing I did forget is that we were talking about pioneers. Also, there are some very new things that have been happening. City Barbecue now has 24 different outlets, and Jenny's has 19. And I wanted to make a comment. On your tables are some restaurant lists. We've compiled we sort of threw this together in the last week. But two things. Number one, there are extra copies if you want to take one home. But if each table would pass them around and add stuff in, we'll add to that and we'll share it with you through the website. So if you think of, when we're talking about stuff, if you think of restaurants that have come and gone, that should be part of Columbus's culinary history, write them down and turn them in with your name tag. Sorry,
okay,
Rich.
we got to throw out a couple more topics. There are 1,054 pizza places in Columbus, Ohio. And I understand that somebody knows of the first one.
TAT had the first pizza. Those of you, anybody go to TAT Restaurant de Familia? So do you know what TAT stands for? Transcontinental Air Transport. So Columbus, when we unveil Port Columbus, and I mean Port Columbus is certainly a very integral part of the city. In fact, there's a group now spearheaded by George O'Donnell working to actually preserve the original Port Columbus that was part of a line that was actually laid out by Charles Lindbergh. And when the TAT came into town, Amelia Earhart was on hand as well to christen Port Columbus. But you would take a train from New York City to Columbus, and then you would fly a Ford Trimotor out into the heartland, and then you would grab another train on your way out to Los Angeles, and you would fly. It cut the time from 7 days from New York to Los Angeles to just 48 hours. So we have a very important monument to that in Columbus that could really use a lot of help, and this is my commercial message, because I know that there's a big fundraiser that the Columbus Historical Society will actually be doing out there on June the 23rd. So we have our table there. You can see Jeffrey or our president, Ben Walters, to talk
Did
about
they
that.
serve TAT pizza on the plane?
Well, no, I don't think they serve TAT pizza on the Ford Trimotor. It'd be great if they did, right? But that's what that stands for, and that was an offshoot of the Prezzutis family as well.
Yep.
So I mean, and there's
And then it took off from there, and there were just, anybody else want to add a few
Well,
favorites?
The classics, and of course, pizza is very subjective. Some people like thin crust, some people like thick crust, and your old high school pizza place is the one For example, Mr. Terapek is clearly a Rubino's kind of guy. Look at him. He's obviously an 09er. We, of course, in Upper Wonderful like Tommy's Pizza and more recently, since 1974, Rotolo's. Let's see, what else are there?
I grew up with Donato's Pizza, and that's another Jane Grody Abel, lady
Another,
CEO.
yes, another lady CEO. And then Anthony's is sort of a cult following in Bexley. But then we moved into the more gourmet pizzas, and I think Spagio with the wood-fired oven was the first of those. And now we have Harvest and Bono and Natalie's brick, or Natalie's coal-fired and yellow brick pizza. So there is a whole fledgling industry from there, Mr. Rich.
I always liked Hank Newman's Pizza on Johnstown Road, because there's a lot of history was there, because you had all these country western people stayed with Hank, and they would do jam sessions, at there, and it's in an earlier book I wrote.
Eagle Pizza in New Albany, another big fan.
Yeah.
I love Eagle Pizza.
We've got just a little bit of time we got about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to ask everybody to get up and talk about their favorite old place, current place, pizza, or whatever. I get to ask one more question. We have several that have been around for a number of years, like Lindy's and others. Can we throw out some of the still standings that we think are still standing?
Well, one of the oldest, it's not a restaurant, Resch's Bakery's been around since 1912. I mean, Resch's was the bakery group that made all the rolls and things for Reeves. Any of you guys remember Reeves Restaurant out on Livingston and Champion? That's in my neighborhood. That's right outside the Old Oaks Historic District. So yeah, I mean, that place, the turtle soup and the bean soup, and in fact, there's a great photograph from about 1949, right after the war, and they were one of the first places in town that was serving some Budweiser, and they were having a competition. They did so well that the folks at Budweiser actually rewarded them by bringing the Clydesdales down Livingston Avenue and parked them in front of the restaurant. There's a great shot from about 1949 with that. And they actually did a lot of their own butchering and things too. I recently got to chat with Lloyd Ballinger's granddaughter. Lloyd was one of the owners after Ed Reed passed away. And they had two kitchens, which I didn't realize. They had a kitchen in the basement where they did a lot of their own butchering as well. And that was another big political hangout, especially for lunch. Especially at the lunchtime. I see Dorothy Teeter in the audience, and I have to share this really quick story. I was talking with Bill Bigelow about the Claremont, and he was telling me at one point, he remembers you coming in, and you were on the outs with one of the commissioners. I can't imagine, but apparently you were. And he liked to play little tricks, so he purposefully sat you sitting right across from that person, so you had to stare at each other during lunch. Yeah. So that was Bill Bigelow, and he had it right before Tom Kaufman did. So I think that's great.
Any others?
Go ahead.
Well, I like Clem's Ringside Cafe.
Yeah.
Because it's just old. I mean, it's been around since, 1900 or so. And
Well, we've got a list of about 25 or 30 that are 35 years or more, but the Cheffonette, of course, is part of my youth. I just went to the Windward Passage. It's no longer smoky, but it's still dark. But they have really good fried Lake Erie perch and walleye. The Red Door, Tommy's Diner.
We already mentioned the top. Yeah.
Lindy's being formerly the Palmer House or the Lindenhof. The Worthington Inn, which is older than anything. There you go. There's
Wings Restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
Any of you guys ever order Warsu Guy when you go out to an Oriental restaurant? Wings was the one that pioneered that, and they said basically they couldn't get people to eat a lot of Asian cookery, so they took fried chicken and they poured soy sauce on it with a little bit of scallions. And they called it Warsu Guy. So.
And that's when they added the Scotch bar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're ready for some questions. If anybody wants to approach the microphone, it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please step to the microphone, give us your name and ask your question, and thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. But on this topic, it may be okay.
Nothing editorial here. Jim Coe from WCBE Restaurant. You're bringing back some fantastic memories. Anybody that's been in a conversation with Doyle Chenoweth about downtown restaurants would hear him mention Mills Cafeteria.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned TAT. That was the Kurova family who, in my memory, had 3 other restaurants other than the TAT that ended up at James and Livingston. Used to be a roast beef joint at Spring and High called Lum's that was part of a chain. theme restaurant over on Front Street called the Waterworks. That supposedly, I've been told by more than one person that worked there, one of the owners was Gary Moore, the TV star. But you could have a seat in a customized old cast iron bathtub. The whole theme of the restaurant was having to do with water and its various.
It was on a sewer cover.
Yes, heavy. It was probably a 5-pound menu.
Elegant eating here.
Son managed the place.
You mentioned Benny Klein's, of course. But remember, around the corner and connected by a common kitchen was Jack and Benny's, which might have been open 24 hours. It was primarily a breakfast place. One of Benny Klein's employees was a immigrant from South America named Garcia, who eventually, and still owns, or his family owns, Garcia's restaurant that used to be a Griesty's near Hudson and High.
Right beside Jack and Benny's.
Jack and Benny's is in homage to Benny Klein and Jack and Benny's. Oh, by the way, speaking of Benny Klein, I was once a waiter at the Neal House. In fact, it was 40 years ago this month, and a resident of the Neal House that came to lunch frequently, and I got the pleasure of serving him, was Mr. Benny Klein, the Pickle King from Cleveland. This was a man that was given life by Damon Runyon. This guy was a character if Columbus ever had a character. And finally, you might remember prior to Elena buying the restaurant that was known as A La Carte, George Dimovich was the founder of A La Carte. His mother worked with him there until they closed it. His mother told me she was a little girl back in the 30s when her father owned a place that's still in operation at 214 East State on the way to Grant Hospital. It's now called Cafe Illyria, and it's owned by a couple that I think are Albanian, because they also own the Warehouse Cafe over in the Warehouse District. But it's been a restaurant. It's like 3 or 4 steps down from the sidewalk. It's probably been there at least since the 30s. Thank you for this. This is a wonderful forum.
Thank you. Fred, you're up.
I'm Fred Looper. I agree with the comment. This has been a lot of fun. Let me dispute with the historians. I thought Massey's beat TAT as the first pizza place in Columbus, but I defer.
Massey's is the first pizza restaurant. TAT was the first restaurant to serve pizza.
Okay.
He's a lawyer.
I'll make
Spring
that
and High.
distinction.
Max's at Spring and High and the Seafood Bay at Spring and High. And here is a quiz for you. Before Wings was Wings, what was the name of it?
Far East.
That's right. Thank you very much.
We can't forget the High Lie either, which actually spent its first years in the short north before it moved up. So,
Hello, I'm John McKnight, and grew up here in Columbus with 2 brothers and a family that was going paycheck to paycheck, and a mother that was a very good cook. And so we didn't eat out much. Mom cooked us a lot of good food, so I'm really enjoying hearing about all these good restaurants, and I'm kind of mad at my parents that I missed out on a lot of them when I was a kid growing up. But I really enjoy going to the little family diners. I live in Clintonville. I like going to McCarthy's Wildflower Cafe. There's Nancy's on High Street there, DK Diner in Grandview, and you mentioned Tommy's on Broad out here. What are some of your favorite diner-ish types of restaurants that you might recommend to me?
Well, you hit on Tommy's and DK Diner. I'm thinking, well, Jack and Benny's actually has a very, very good breakfast. And one of the other, let's see, jump in there.
Well, jump in. I'm from Clintonville. I go to the same place as he does.
I
Well, the Cheffonette.
I like the Grill and Skillet out in Bexley. We go there oftentimes. The Grill and Skillet.
Yep.
It's a good place. The Killing Grill.
Starliner Diner.
Is there going to be a place in our future for diners like that? Are they going to continue on, or as the chains come in and take over, are we going to start losing our little family neighborhood diners, do you think?
Actually, we have a real healthy
Thank you.
Columbus-owned community of chefs and restaurant operators called Dine Originals. There are 55 of them in a large group. They do some things. They had, a couple weeks ago, they had a program at Capital University. You can go and just eat all evening for a very limited amount of money. It was the Hankies and the Boudreaux's, Kamal, a bunch of from the refectory. They're going strong, and we need to support them, obviously. Thank you.
There's a lot of gastropubs and small coffee shops that are opening up too that are kind of filling some of that niche. In fact, there's a wonderful one here on Long Street called the Roosevelt that I just got to go to the other day. It's really fantastic.
I think that's a good point, that the gastropubs are filling some of the need. They're casual. There's a wide array of foods, much of it home cooked. And gastropubs are really pubs that have real chefs, everything from Craft House Number 5 to the Crest and its progeny. And I think that may be a
Sycamore,
trend.
Wolf's Ridge.
Sycamore,
Yeah.
Wolf's Ridge.
Hi, I'm Chris Graves with CMC, and I just was motivated to come up, and I had to comment because no one has mentioned TJ's.
None of us have.
You're right.
I mean, you
Local
have,
chain,
that's
yeah.
right. I mean,
Right.
it makes more money after midnight than it does during the rest of the day. But the Barnyard Buster
Right?
is a phenomenon.
Sure. And I think a lot of people miss places like Village Junction in German Village. Maybe the mainliner that was on East Main Street. I'm thinking of the places that Roy Tuggle and Milt Lusnauer had. Green Gables on the west side. So Jerry's on the
Which is
north
now a
side.
TJ's.
That's what made me think of it. Yeah. So
And then also Max and Irma's.
Yes. Yeah.
sure. And any of you guys ever go to Max and
Beginning.
Irma's when they still had the telephones and you could call to the other tables? Novelty restaurants, sure.
Yeah, when we got together to discuss what we were going to discuss, we quickly realized there was far too many things to discuss them all. I mean, there's just, we're an embarrassment of riches when it comes to restaurants.
But help us build this list, so.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the other small places that we're talking about is Skillet, which does have a historical background in that the chef is Chef Caskey of the same dry cleaning company. Yeah.
Another one that perhaps was overlooked, and again, I'm sort of like Jim. I come from sort of that restaurant college years days. So Pavilion Restaurant at the Ohio State Inn, which was known for its pink squirrel and grasshopper pie. And almost every afternoon, I drew the afternoon shift, I'd say once every couple of weeks. I had Jonathan Winters, the comedian who came in, was from West Jefferson, who was actually a neighbor to my college roommate, so he would come in to check on her, and he was a trip. And Woody Hayes, who just wanted to be left alone, and one can understand why. But the Blue Danube has been there forever, and the Blue Do, and it's in a former Piggly Wiggly building. And also an auto showroom at one point, but it was a white tablecloth Hungarian restaurant with a grand piano in it. And Larry's started very much the same way. The Paoletti family was actually a white tablecloth kind of restaurant too. And then there's the High Lie, of course, you know.
and of course, Rich is well known for his frequent visits to the Huddle on 15th Avenue during the 60s.
The Huddle, and then there was the Iron Kettle. So there's a lot of the campus ones that are still around too.
And well, Hennick's as well, which was a big hangout in the 30s and 40s.
Hey, Roger?
Roger?
Well, since Max and Irma's was mentioned, I think we should give tribute to a great restaurateur named Barry Zacks.
Oh.
Yes.
Barry, of course, along with Todd Barnum, walked into a little bar and said, Max and Irma, we'd like to buy this and take it bigger. And of course we did. But Barry had the gift of hospitality. If you were ever in his home, people said, you ought to run a restaurant. It's so much fun to be your place. And so he did. He owned the Claremont. And he also started one called the Court of Small Clams.
Briefly.
Briefly. Unfortunately, Barry was much better at making great hospitality and food than he was at managing a P&L statement. And it might be of historical interest, the Max and Irma's stock had gone as an IPO from 15 down to pennies, literally. And that was purchased, that stock, actually mainly Barry's stock, which became the gift that established a hotel on campus at Ohio State. And so you can really thank Max and Irma's not only for Cameron Mitchell having his epiphany and getting into the restaurant business there.
Yeah.
55 group.
Say again?
We all, the
55
55 group, we forgot
55. But he actually started out at Max and Irma's first. He went. That was his first managing, and the money to build the Blackwell came from Max and Irma's stock, actually.
I still have my G.D. Ritzy stock somewhere.
And you know, you
Jane,
can,
did you
can
have
still
one?
get
Wait.
the 55 dressing at the Polaris Grill, just
Yeah.
so that you know that.
The 55 on the Boulevard dressing.
Double nickel
We
salad.
can't get the Cesta salad from the highlight, however. Jane?
Well, quickly, I can't let us forget all the restaurants that were in the brewery districts besides Hankey's. The whole group that Pete Edwards started, Pete's Steakhouse and Bellantini's, and I can't remember the name of the seafood place, but Gibby's, their tri-cheese sandwich or whatever it was that was fried, dairy on top of dairy with butter on it. It was killer. But then it gave way to BG Salvi's with the pasta salvi, which was fried, whatever, deep fried. I mean, it was a theme in the brewery district, right? But those were fun places and kind of cult places, and Howl at the Moon. I mean, I'm not sure how they did with food, but people went.
There's a
and
new
were
place down there
entertained.
called Westie's that you ought to try.
Yes,
too. It's a lot of fun.
Westie's
It's
is
a gastropub.
fabulous. So those were part of an era that were part of our entertainment era. I'm curious to know if there's some of the restaurants now in the Arena District that are worthy of mentioning today.
Well, there's one that imported, again, Cleveland and Cincinnati have found us, and Cincinnati restaurateur opened Nada, which is right across from the arena west of it, very, very good, sort of haute Mexican cuisine. And let's see what else we have down there that we want to talk about in the
Well,
arena.
it's a Cleveland import. It's not the brewery district, but I love Flipside at Easton. If you like a hamburger,
Yeah.
a good hamburger place.
And Michael
Simon's B-Spot. Yeah, Strong Water,
Strong Water's great.
which
On
is
the west side.
is in Franklinton on the west side, the old EBCO building. A lot of fun.
You mentioned all the fun
Yeah.
places.
Oh,
We
Danny's.
Die Bowls. If anybody with the human accordion with legs, Esther Craw.
Esther Craw.
Right. So,
And
or Engine House number 5. Have your birthday cake delivered upside down.
We can go on for a long time.
Manor Core.
Yep. From Cleveland also is Danny's and Lexi's, and somebody mentioned Charbert's, the Charbar, et cetera. Okay. I think you want to speak to us, Bill.
I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. Remember that you can view and share all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU, and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime you like on CMC's website via YouTube. Before we conclude, please help me thank our sponsors, the Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Fund, and our partners, the Columbus Historical Society and the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and our speakers, Doug Motes, Steve Stover, David Myers, Rich Terapak. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at CMC again soon.